Thanks. So I think now we can formally start. Unfortunately, we are 10 participants. Hopefully more come along the way. Should somebody be joining and I haven't seen it since I'll be sharing the slides, you can please alert me. So I'm going to share my screen for the presentation for today. Okay, some people wanted to join, but okay, I'm seeing new members joining. Welcome back, Yusuf, I think. I personally think probably some participants tried joining with a previous link, which was a little bit of a mistake. So yeah, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, yes, we can.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So without further much ado, my sincere apologies on behalf of Farisa and Elijah as well for quite the lack of coordination in terms of starting on time. However, I think there are more numbers joining in, so we can proceed well. As I mentioned, my name is Brian Kithinji. I'm currently the Executive Director of Policy Action Initiative. I don't want to make as much time on the introduction bit because the topic for the discussion today is quite lengthy. So today we are going to talk about migration in East Africa, and I notice we may be having participants in this call from outside East Africa. But when we talk about migration, we are going to focus on three specific areas. So we are going to look at labor migration, meaning that movement of workers, looking at also movement of goods and services, because at the end of the day, the main point of labor is production, and production is in the form of goods and services, which is trade. We are also going to look at forced displacement, which technically I'm going to dispel whether it belongs to migration and what are some of the international laws that surround that topic. But also we are going to look at one of the emerging areas for migration, which is climate mobility, or rather climate-induced human migration. And we know that in East Africa, we are currently experiencing a diverse range of migration patterns, which I shall be explaining the forms of migration that are happening. But first and foremost, I have to share about the key terms, because these terms we've seen or we've had them being used interchangeably many times, sometimes wrongly, especially in the case, like, for example, in the United States of America, where there's a currently big debate of migration. And then now you hear most of the time the leaders talking about migration as referring to refugees or asylum seekers, which is quite different. So migrants simply means a person who moves by choice. We do not have, as of now, we don't have like a solid international legal framework that defines who is a migrant or what are some of the choices that may force somebody to move. But we know that economic migrants, there's also voluntary, academic, like all these forms could be forms of migration, as long as the key thing it's by choice. Whereby for refugee, we know that a refugee, according to the United Nations the United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951, it seriously states that a refugee should be a person who's fleeing either persecution, violence, conflict, like there has to be forced displacement. So if today I decide to move from Nairobi to Arusha and settle there for 3 months, I'm not a refugee, I am a migrant. However, now because I am moving by choice, I cannot be afforded special protections under the law, because the Refugee Convention, which has informed the Refugee Act in Kenya, the laws of refugee and immigration in Rwanda, all these laws are based on the Refugee Convention definition of who is a refugee. And we also know that this IDP, we've seen it especially when there's conflict within the country. For example, when in Kenya we had the 2007, 2008 post-election violence, but also as well, we've seen it in the case of Uganda as well during the periods of instability between Milton Obote's rule to Idi Amin, during the time of Idi Amin and the wars that ensued until now we have the current president, Yoweri Museveni of NRM. So internally displaced is within the country. Outside the country, outside the borders, now you become a refugee. But the key thing of these two is this forced displacement due to violence, persecution, or conflict. And then asylum seekers is somebody who's claiming refugee status but awaiting decision. So for example, if I was to go to Tanzania, if by accident or by mistake there's violence in Kenya, and then I flee to Tanzania and I apply to become a refugee, that period, as I wait for the formal recognition, I am an asylum seeker. So in many cases, a migrant can also be an asylum seeker if he or she is claiming refugee status. So in the case for the American case, where you have now the southern border and all this debate, those people who go to the United States and want to apply for citizenship, they are asylum seekers. They are migrants, but they stop being migrants because now they want to apply for that refugee status and to be able to get citizenship or to get permanent residency in the United States of America. In this case now, when we look at the distinction between refugees and migrants outside of the United Nations Refugee Convention of 1951, we know that right to work, access to healthcare, education, and protection from deportation are actually given to refugees vis-a-vis migrants. So you find that 80% of refugees get right to work, access to healthcare, right to education, because when you become a refugee, you get that formal protection. You also get like a temporary, like an ID card that identifies you as a refugee. So you are able to go get work, get employment, open a bank account. Vis-a-vis, if you go as a migrant, you are not recognized. So you don't get this protection. You cannot go, for example, to the Ministry of Interior if I'm going to go to Rwanda today to go and settle there and do a job. I cannot go and claim formal documents without like passing the process. Now, because of the ESC, and I'll explain about the common market, yes, you may go there and start a business and do your business. But if I was to go to a country where we don't have that protocol on free movement of goods and persons, like if I'm a Kenyan and I go to a country, let's say in Egypt, and I go to Egypt, I prolong my visa. My visa was a business visa for 1 week. I stayed there past 1 week. So 3 months in Egypt, I cannot go and start a business because I don't have formal documentation. Remember, a migrant is not recognized in international law because there's no formal like definition of it. So now those are the statistics that I wanted to share about work, healthcare. These are more accessible to refugees vis-a-vis migrants. So when we talk about forms of migration, there's always voluntary labor migration. That one we know because it's quite common. People move from one area to another to search for jobs. We also know about the diaspora return. So for example, when there was a genocide that happened in Rwanda in 1994, we know that many Rwandans had to flee to neighboring countries. And during that period from 1994, most after the genocide ended, they now had to come back. So that movement of diaspora who had gone outside of the country, either due to the political regime or due to economic factors, and now they're coming back. That's also a form of migration that has been in ESC since it was formed. We also know that seasonal and temporary migration, like in the form of the informal workers who work along the border between Kenya, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Tanzania, Burundi. There are always these workers who move from one place to another. So for example, you find that like in Uganda, because Uganda is one of the largest producers of bananas, you find that informal workers who trade in agricultural products now come to Kenya, do their trading over like 1 month, and then they cross back to the other side of the border. So that's seasonal temporary migration. We also have family reunification, particularly because we know that when the boundaries were drawn in the conference by Otto von Bismarck in Berlin, we know that the boundaries cut across different tribes and different families. So you find like the Maasais are in Kenya and in Tanzania. And especially this actually works in the coastal region where you find that the Digo and the Duruma, the Mijikenda communities, are in the Kenyan coastal region, but they are also in the Tanzanian region. So they are allowed to cross, like, for example, you find some of the Kenyan coastal community crossing to Tanzania. They stay over the Christmas period with their family members and they go back. So that seasonal and temporary migration also happens. And the statistics about migration and why it's important and why it's a topic that should be debated upon are there. We know 3 million migrant workers in ESC countries. And we also know that there are also international migrant workers. One thing that I wanted to share, which is very important and what we should consider when you talk about just migration is, as you can see, the share of population living in urban areas is expanding. The point that now we have 24% of the country's population in all of East African Community member states are in urban areas. Now, this is a problem because we know that because of this rapid growth of urbanization, which is caused typically by migration, economic migrants seeking better livelihoods, or climate migrants escaping from unproductive areas, which are becoming more and more unproductive due to the harsh climatic conditions. We know that because of this situation that is happening, that we are now having the rise of more and more informal settlements. You can call it ghettos in Kampala. In Kenya, we call them slums, or favelas in Brazil for those who come from America, South America, Latin America. So in this case, because of now, we have to create just systems of migration, because when you look at all this, the rapid rate of urbanization and all these people who are coming to urban areas, and we know that our amenities cannot be enough to be able to handle this population. If we leave this, we are going to end up in a situation whereby our cities are full of crime. Our cities, the drainage does not work, flooding occurs quite frequently, there's high unemployment. So the reason why when you talk about just migration is to find a system whereby even when people migrate, it becomes a form of adaptation. By adaptation, meaning that not just climate adaptation, but adaptation to the economic areas. So you find that if we can have systems whereby if people are going to move to, let's say, the capital city, Dar es Salaam, to look for jobs, can we get procedures whereby we can devolve some of these resources to other areas so that they don't have to move all the way and to create congestion within the cities. But that's also one of the factors that we should consider when talking about a just migration. So I'll have to explain a little bit about the history of the East African community, and I'll go back to back during the colonial rule, leave alone 1967. We know that in Kenya, like Kenya, Uganda were colonized by Britain. Kenya was an protectorate under the Imperial British East African Company. It was set up in 1896, a protectorate, then we became a British colony in 1920. Uganda became a British colony much earlier because Uganda was ruled more through direct rule, the role of the Baganda Kingdom. That's a different topic for another day. But in Tanzania, which was called German East Africa during that period when Germans established colonial rule in 1890, and then the British took over in 1917. So when the Britain took over Tanzania, now they called it Tanganyika. Remember, it was German East Africa. Now they called it Tanganyika. In that period, under the rule of the British. The situation for Rwanda and Burundi is quite different, because we know that in Rwanda, first it was under Belgian rule, then after that the French took over. Same applies to Burundi. So Rwanda and Burundi were not part of this customs union. It was only the three countries governed by Britain. So when it came independence, Kenya got it in 1963, Tanganyika got it in 1961, and Uganda got it in 1962. Then Tanganyika, of course, merged with Zanzibar in 1964, then became the United Republic of Tanzania, now that we call it. That's when in 1967, the presidents of Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda met together, and they decided to form the East African Community with the goal of harmonizing, like having one trade union and being able to speak in one voice, create free movement. And that is when we had even the East African Airways. There was a national airline for the East African Community. And the funny part was, now, just 10 years later, the EAC was dissolved. Why was it dissolved? But most of this blame lies with Idi Amin. Because when EAC was being founded, it was President Milton Obote was the president of Uganda. He had overthrown Kabaka, the Sir Edward, who was the first president of Uganda. He had overthrown it, but there was a little bit of stability in Uganda. And Kenya was ruled by President Jomo Kenyatta, and Tanzania was being ruled by the founding father, Julius Nyerere. So 1977 now, Idi Amin is in power in Uganda. And Idi Amin has this tendency of, he wants to take over land in Kenya. He wants to invade Tanzania, which he did later on, if you can remember the story back then. So now, because of that, you cannot have a common market or a customs union if there is one party that wants to invade its neighbors and cause all this tension. And that's why the EAC was dissolved. And there's even a funny story of that. The Kenya took over the East African Airways planes, and now they formed Kenya Airways. And that's why Kenya Airways was more successful as a national airline than any of the airlines from the East African region, because they remained with all the planes in Nairobi. But that's a funny story. So now in 2000, we now had the treaty for the East African Community signed, and the common market, which we shall be discussing more about it, was adopted in 2005, and it came into force in 2010. Speaking about the pillars of integration for the East African community and why the Common Market Protocol is important is because we know that the integration of the EAC is based on four main pillars. Customs union, which is about eliminating tariffs and non-tariff barriers, but also imposing a single tariff on goods that are coming from that are being imported from other regions outside of the East African community. We also have the common market, which is now what we're going to talk about, which is all about the free movement of goods, labor, services, person, harmonization of standards. We also have the political federation, which is all about establishing a federal structure with our common institutions, common parliament, like we have the EALA, the East African Legislative Assembly, we have the East African Court of Justice, and of course there was this idealistic goal of having a single presidency, which I don't know whether it will ever work based on the current situations whereby some countries have not even had a change in leadership for a long period of time. And also now we had the monetary union having a common currency. What is important here to note is Common Market Protocol fits in with the economic integration pillar. So political is about politics. We know that political governing, but common market is very important for the economic side. If you're going to have economic integration of the East African region, we need to implement the Common Market Protocol. And what does the Common Market Protocol entail? It entails 5 key things, which we should remember even as we go on with this call and even as we have the debate or even in future in our activities. One pillar is a free movement of people and labor. And here, this is something that hasn't been implemented as much. But if the Common Market Protocol was to be implemented to the fullest, it means that there should be no worker fees. If I'm moving to go and work in Uganda, I should be able to go get employed in Uganda, pay the same tax as a Ugandan national. If I am moving to Tanzania, I should be able to move with my national identification card, which recognizes I'm Kenyan. I don't have to apply for a temporary passport or a passport, as is the case. Free movement of labor, it means that also if I'm to move to Burundi, for example, or Burundians come here, they don't be charged extra taxes, extra customs, because there is free movement of labor within the common market, which consists of the member states of the East African community, which I have to highlight. We have South Sudan, we have Uganda, we have Kenya, we have Tanzania, we have Burundi, we have Rwanda. I know DR Congo has joined the East African community in 2022. However, something to remember for the purposes of this conversation is that the DRC has not yet fully ascended into the common market. So there's a roadmap that the East African Community Council of Ministers were discussing, and they were to give the DRC so that they can be able to implement and to ratify and integrate the Common Market Protocol within the existing national laws, which, surprise, surprise, we know may not really happen as much now because already DRCs encounter allegations with some of the member states of the East African community over the conflict that is happening within their country. So that also has stalled. And we know that for you to join to fully implement or to fully join they join the EAC treaty, but for you to adopt any of these protocols, it requires the full accession of all the members of the EAC. So if one member declines, then it means DRC cannot be able to be fully integrated on the Common Market Protocol, even if they rationalize their laws. There's also the free movement of goods and services. There's the harmonization of standards and recognition of qualifications. This is very important because you know that we have the Inter-University Council of Academic Affairs for the East African region, which means if I study my bachelor's degree in Kenya, it should be recognized in Tanzania. I don't have to go and certify it at the Commission of University Education in Kenya and go and certify it in Tanzania for me to be able to get a position or to be able to do my master's in any Tanzanian university. Because by recognition of qualifications, it means qualifications attained in any East African community member states are recognized across the region. Free movement of capital, it's very important because we know that there's the disbursement, there's disbursements, there's also the money that is flowing from the diaspora, the remittances, which is a very, very big, I think it contributes around 3.4% of the region's GDP. So free movement of capital is also a thing. So if I'm going to work in Uganda, when I send money back to Kenya, I don't have to pay extra charges. And then there's also right of establishment and residency of EAC nationals, which is also a big factor as well in the Common Market Protocol, as I will explain later on. So when you talk about implementation of the Common Market Protocol, where are we currently? So I'm going to pick the harmonization of standards as one pillar. When I look at harmonization of standards, we know that Article 81 of the ESC Treaty establishes that single framework for standardization and testing and for metrology and testing. However, what we know that in each country, there are national standards. So Kenya has its standards, Burundi has its standards, Rwanda has its standards, Uganda has its standards. And this means that if we are to fully implement the Common Market Protocol, the region should adopt an ESC mark of conformity, meaning that goods that are produced in Kenya and Tanzania, instead of having the KEB sticker in Kenya, Tanzania having their own sticker, Uganda has their Bureau of Standard sticker, we have one sticker for the ESC. Why is it so? Because we know that if you don't harmonize standards, there's extra cost for exporters or producers of these products and also for importers. So this affects small-scale traders a lot, even more than the large companies, because small-scale traders are the ones, or retailers, they're the ones who buy goods from the large suppliers and then come and sell it within the different member states and within different towns and cities until the grassroots level. So there has been talk about harmonization of standards. However, this hasn't been fully implemented. But when you talk about implementing the Common Market Protocol and having just migration, this is one of the factors that we should consider. How do we harmonize our standards to ensure small-scale traders across the region are playing on an equal or even playing field? Then we also know that Article 11 of the Common Market Protocol requires recognizing academic and professional qualifications. However, there are only four professions where we've had mutual recognition agreements within the East African community. And that is accountancy, engineering, architecture, and veterinary science. It means that if today I am a lawyer, I have attained my qualifications in law in Kenya, I cannot go and work as an advocate in Tanzania without being again passing through the Tanzanian School of Law, which is sad. If today I'm a journalist in Kenya, for me to go to Rwanda, I have to again apply for accreditation with the Media Council in Rwanda. This hasn't been implemented. So when you talk about just migration, we have to ensure that we have academic and professional qualifications are mutually recognized across our region, so that because we know that most of the time it is young people, it is informal workers who are affected by this, because they are the people who are trying to get a job, trying to earn a higher living or higher income. So if they are going to go, if they move from one country to another, they have to get recognition again, and the cost and the bureaucratic time sometimes will have to venture into corruption for you to get your academic certifications to be certified by the authority there. We have to settle these things. So we have to push for the implementation of Article 11 of the Common Market Protocol. One other area about how the status of the implementation of the Common Market Protocol is on free movement of goods, persons, and services. And this is where, to be honest, we have to acknowledge that a lot has been done within the East African community to implement this area, because we know that there are 22 one-stop border posts currently across the East African community member states. Like in Kenya, Uganda, Busia, I know many of us in the call probably have passed through this. In Kenya, Tanzania, we know you can pass through Namanga, Lunga. And this one-stop border post are not just to make your movement easy. It's not like for you to go there, take a selfie. I'm crossing to Tanzania and it's taken me only 30 minutes or less. It's not about that. It's about ensuring that the goods, when the goods are coming, they don't pass through a system of customs on this side, customs on that side. It is to ensure that when they come, they just pass. In fact, one-stop border post assists more in free movement of goods, even more than persons. We needed it a lot because we know that intra-trade within the ESC region is higher than trade between ESC and outside. So for example, Uganda is the largest trading partner of Kenya. Kenya gets most of its agricultural produce from Tanzania and Uganda. Rwanda, for a period of time, was the biggest. Kenya was its biggest exporter of services, technical capacity when it was rebuilding after the genocide. So when you talk about one-stop border post, we really need it, and this is something that continues to be implemented. However, as you can see, there are areas that are lacking. So for example, Tanzania-Uganda corridor, there's only one-stop border post. I know that Tanzania and Uganda, most of the border is taken up by Lake Victoria, and there is also the movement of ferries from the Tanzanian side to the Ugandan side. However, this is an area or room for improvement, as well as you can see for Uganda and South Sudan, or even Tanzania and Burundi, there's only one stop border post. And we know that for Burundi, especially as a landlocked country, they require a lot of trade and a lot of movement to the outside world. So again, this is an area for improvement. However, we have to recognize that some efforts have been done. And now when you talk about a just movement within the East, just migration within the East African region, is to ensure that this one-stop border post work, is to ensure that we have competent immigration and customs officials, is to ensure that you don't have corruption in this one-stop border post. I can give you an example. During COVID, I don't know how many people experienced it, but there was paying of bribes. People had to pay bribes to, like, because they would ask you for a COVID-19 vaccine, for COVID-19 test certificate. If you don't have it, you have to pay bribes for you to cross to the other area. And we've seen these instances many times. I use the Busia border post a lot, and I've seen many times Kenyan, Ugandan officials asking for bribes at the one-stop border post. So we have to deal with corruption in this one-stop border post, even as we talk about a just migration within the region. One thing about rise of establishment, and this is something very, very close to my heart, is we need to focus here a lot. And the reason why I say that is because we know that we've seen discrimination happening, especially to migrants from countries that are technically have a lower GDP. So for example, in Kenya, we know that there are so many Burundian migrants who are coming to Kenya as well as South Sudan because they have a lower GDP than Kenya and they've experienced conflicts within their period. However, these are primarily economic migrants, not refugees. So you find that there's a lot of discrimination from police and legal authorities. They cannot be able to go set up their business, get the required documentation on land, things like that. Like I know even in Tanzania, if you're a foreigner, you cannot go to Tanzania, if I'm not wrong, and own land. And even for company, when you set up a company, at least 50% has to be owned by the local. So when you talk about rights of establishment, we have to ensure that we remove nationality-based restrictions for citizens within the East African region. So that now, if I'm a Kenyan, I want to go and own land in Tanzania, I just go, show my identification card, pay for the land and get it. If I want to set up a company, I can do the same. The same applies to Tanzanians coming to Kenya, Burundians coming to Kenya, Rwandans going to Burundi as well, Ugandans going to South Sudan, across. And as you can see, only Kenya and Rwanda also have waived work permit fees for ESC nationals. So this is an area for massive, massive improvement. Burundi and Rwanda, I know they've had border closures because of the politics of the countries. There's been a lot of animosity and enmity, which hasn't started now. I can go through the history of Rwanda and Burundi on another day, on another topic, and why these two countries have had like bitter relations during a period of time. However, their language and the ethnicity are very, very similar. We know that the ongoing conflict of, come in.
My question is regarding, like, I know the implementation of the Common Market Protocol, the mission of it is to make sure that trade and migration and things like that, it makes it easy for somebody to go to a certain place within the EAC to work and live and avoid any type of fees and unnecessary corruption. So my question is, often I keep seeing that only certain members of the EAC are only certain members are aligning themselves within the Common Market Protocol. And that's what I'm curious about. Like, why is it only certain members of the countries of the community that are applying themselves to it? Why isn't it everyone? Is there a reason why certain member states are not conforming to this?
Yeah, I would say the answer lies within the government policy of those member states. And the reason why I say that is because I'll give you an example of when during the period why ESC was dissolved. If you can remember how I talked about it, that ESC was formed, there was very good relations between Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And now Uganda has a change of government and Idi Amin comes in and Idi Amin wants to take over land in Kenya and Tanzania. So he says, we can't have ESC anymore. So it depends with the government policy. Like, for example, the government of Rwanda and even the government in Kenya were so quick to implement most of these elements of the Common Market Protocols. For example, waiving work permit fees, just requiring identification cards instead of you coming with your passport. However, there are some countries, and the justification has always been, like for Burundi, the justification the government has always said is, Rwanda's current government has an intention of taking over Burundi and installing a government that is friendly to them. So that's why they've been closing the border against Rwanda, because they feel that President Kagame has intentions of invading their country and interfering. We know the relationship between DRC, for example, and Rwanda, DRC, and Uganda for a period of time. In fact, the relationship is even bitter as of now. If you can hear what the presidents have been bickering on international media. We know, like in Tanzania, the case has always been, Tanzania has always felt that if they were to open up, for example, allow this to happen, then they may not be able to protect their industries from other member states, especially Kenyans may come over and take over their industries and employment opportunities. And that's why, and for them, they have always said, let us get to a level where we are at par economically. Because you can see, like in EAC, Kenya's economy is high. At a time before Tanzania's John Pombe Magufuli took over in 2015, Tanzania was quite low, Uganda was quite low, Rwanda as well when it was rebuilding post-genocide. So there was a feeling that we aren't yet at one level economically together, but once we get to this level, then we can now be able to open up our markets, allow for this free movement of goods, persons, and services without restrictions. So the factors are government policy, but also as well the economic standards within the region, the GDP of the countries involved. And this is something that may change within the coming years, especially either through change of government or when we get to a level where our GDPs are at par and there is less competition.
Okay, so what I'm understanding is that even though the Common Market Protocol has its EAC members, what changes how it is applied and implemented is the leaders of government who are in power at the time and whether they want to get with the program.
Yes, exactly.
I see.
Yes, because we have not yet implemented a political federation. We don't have a single presidency. So any decision taken by the EAC is like decisions by the UN. It depends on the member states implementing it. If the member states ignore, then it doesn't see the light of the day. Until we get to a level where we have a political federation, one chain of power and control, now we can have some of these decisions being implemented directly or through a centralized system. But as of now, that's not the case, unfortunately.
I see.
Yeah. So building upon that, thank you so much, Hobbs, for your question. Building upon that, the national laws on migration within the East African community, I wouldn't want to spend much time, but this is just to highlight so that if anyone wants to research on this, I would advise you really check out the Citizenship and Immigration Act in Kenya, but also our Refugee Act, which was amended in 2021, Tanzania's Refugee Act as well. But one important thing about Tanzania is that Tanzania adopted into law the EAC Common Market Implementation Act, which states how Tanzania is going to why Tanzania ratified and what Tanzania will do to implement the EAC Common Market within Tanzanian laws. Rwanda as well, their laws on immigration, Uganda's Refugee Act, and Uganda, we know that has been one of the leading and active countries when it comes to laws and just migration, especially for refugees and asylum seekers, based on the fact that Uganda has hosted, I think currently they are hosting 1.8 million refugees from South Sudan and also the Democratic Republic of Congo. And also look at Burundians' laws on migration. One unique thing about Burundi is Burundi has a national policy on migration. And I think this one of the reasons why they came up with this policy is because Burundi was seeing many migrants and refugees as well coming from the Democratic Republic of Congo because they share a border, and the side of Burundi that shares a border with DRC is the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo region near Lake Kivu, where there has been much of this violence. So there've been a lot of migrants crossing from DRC, trying to find jobs, trying to find employment, study in schools. And so Burundi came up with that national policy on migration, which is quite unique. And this is one of the legal frameworks that I would advise if you can have time to go and research and read about it and see how Burundi came up with this law and what it entails and how this differs from their laws on immigration and the Refugee Act. Again, as I said, and I'll reiterate, there's a very big difference between migration, migrants, and refugees and asylum seekers. That's one thing I want us to take away from this call so much. So moving from that, I'll also talk about climate mobility. And climate mobility is one of the new areas that has come up when we talk about migration. And the reason is because now we are seeing increasing effects of climate change within our region, within the world, but especially in Africa, because Africa contributes less than 3% of global climate emissions, yet the impacts of climate change are felt more here based on our geography and based on our population. So now we have a new term of climate mobility where people are moving or they're being displaced just because of climate change events. And this can be seen, like in Kenya, over 80% of the country is arid. So communities that stay in the arid region, they're experiencing so many bouts of drought. And these are communities which are traditionally pastoralist communities. So they keep hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cows. And so now the cows are dying, the goats are dying during the perennial bouts of drought. So they have to move to search either for income generating opportunities or to search for food. So they become climate migrants. This is also happening in Uganda as well, in Tanzania as well, due to occurrences of floods. We've seen what has been happening near the Lake Victoria Shores region and Lake Tanganyika as well. This has happened as well in Burundi, Rwanda, due to landslides as well. So this is a phenomenon that is happening in all these East African community countries. And climate mobility should be considered when you talk about a just migration in the East African region, because its effects can be seen more than any other form of migration. So when people are being forced to move from one area to another due to climate change, when they go to another area, they cause that we know the influx of population within that given area. So how do we give these people services? How do we ensure we also protect the communities that have stayed within their lands for generations? Because we don't want to see displacement of communities, because this will bring tensions and conflict. And we know that in our laws today, there is no standalone law that addresses climate mobility. There was a protocol that came about, which was Kampala Declaration on Migration, Environment, and Climate Change. However, most African countries have not yet ratified it. In East Africa, it's only Kenya and Uganda which have ratified that protocol. So we are in a situation whereby climate mobility is emerging. However, we haven't come up with regulations and legislative frameworks that address it. So when we talk about just migration, let us not just focus on economic migrants. Let us also talk about climate migrants, because this is something that will become even more of a phenomena in the coming years. Because we know if we continue seeing floods happening, communities that live in urban informal settlements within the coastal region, for example, Mombasa, Dar es Salaam, Lamu, they'll be forced to move. Communities even that live in hilly areas will be forced to move to other areas. So when they move to other areas, do we have systems that allow them to resettle? Do we have systems that give them protection, like give them access to new identification cards, bank statements, documents, because most of the time when they move, they have lost everything? Do we have climate financing to be able to give these communities to adapt to this new situation? And how can we use migration as an adaptation strategy? So we did a policy paper around this area, which I'd be glad to share it in the chats once I finish the presentation, which talks about climate mobility within the region and what are some of the interventions that could be implemented to address it. And this is something that I would also advise, if you can do more research and read about it, read about the Kampala Declaration, Migration on Environment and Climate Change, and the status of climate mobility, not just within East African region, but Africa as a whole, and also Asia, because we share quite a number of similar socioeconomic and geographical factors, to see what are some of the interventions that could be addressed to deal with this issue. So this comes a time when I would like us to have like a mini discussion. I think because we are very few, there will be no need for us to go into breakout rooms, because the numbers I think are a bit minimal. But you could have an open discussion. Probably I'll open the floor for 5 minutes, where we can identify gaps or barriers in practice of the Common Market Protocol. Bearing in mind, before even we go there, one thing that I forgot to mention as well is that when we talk about migrants and refugees, we know that we have the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, which is headquartered in Geneva, where I was there in April when negotiating for the BRS conventions. And we know that migration is under the International Organization for Migration. So even the UN agencies that deal with these two topics are quite different. That's another difference about migrants and refugees. We have IOM that deals with migrants, and we have UNHCR that deals with refugees. Climate migration has been dealt with by IOM because it talks about migrants. However, the cases we've seen of asylum seekers or refugees or IDP camps, not IDP camps per se, but refugee camps in Uganda, like the refugees who came from South Sudan, that is a factor under the UNHCR. So let's not confuse these two institutions when you talk about migration. So with that, I will open just for this live activity for us to take a maximum of 5 minutes to identify gaps and barriers within the implementation of the Common Market Protocol. Like Hobbes, yes, Arnold, come in.
Thank you, Brian. I've been trying to keep up with you. You are very well versed in this topic, and myself and my student Amiri, we're trying to catch up. So I have a question that hopefully you can help. I was trying to listen. How does the Maasai tribe fit into being migrants? Because I looked at them as herders, and as I heard about them, how they move across the lines, but the government policy were kind of stopping them. But it kind of triggered me when you talk about the climate aspect of the Common Market Protocol, because aren't the Maasai moving so that they can do their natural customs according to the weather and things of that sort? So I guess the bigger question is, how does the Maasai tribe or other tribes like that, how do they fit into all of this when they cross international lines, in my way, freely? But maybe you could help me out with that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Arnold, for the question. That's a very important one because traditionally these communities are nomadic communities. Like for generations, they've been moving from one area to another with their livestock. However, when they can be classified as climate migrants is when they leave their traditional lands. Like in this case, Maasais are majorly within the southern Rift Valley region, and they go to another area that is occupied by a different community. So for example, if they moved from southern Rift Valley region to the coastal region, which is occupied by the Mijikenda and Taita community, which is like 200 kilometers away from where they are. So now they become classified as climate migrants because they've left where they used to be there, and now they are going to a totally different location, and that location has been occupied by this community. So they are also causing displacement of this community or tension with that local community because they are coming to their area. So now when we talk about migration, we have to find ways where now when they come, they can be resettled, but also the local community allows them either to come in temporarily and then go back to their lands, or find a way for them to resettle permanently, which is hard. I don't know whether any community can allow to give up their land permanently to have another community come and settle. But it's something that has caused a lot of cattle rustling, a lot of tension, especially between in Kenya, we have the term of the Northern Triangle between Pokot, Turkana, Samburu, and Maasai communities. They are always fighting amongst each other because Pokot are traditionally farmers. They are highland nilots, so they do farming. Samburu keep animals. Turkana, they are a little bit laid back. Most do farming, a bit do fishing, but they have a lot of land and pastures. So all these communities are moving to Turkana, but Turkana has a population of 1 million. So they have been fighting back, and there's been a lot of fights between these communities. If you can even check about what has been happening, there's been a lot of conflict and fighting between these communities, and it's something that will continue happening, unfortunately, due to climate change.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Arnold. Go back to the
If nobody
activity.
else has a question, I do have a follow-up. Let me just jump in there. Because again, that I'm catching up on a lot of the terminology and the regions and the names of them, so I can understand it. And again, you're giving me things I can go back to help my team out. But how does the wartime? I know you mentioned the war and fighting back. I'm not sure if it's still how big or active it is in Sudan, but how does war in different countries affect the displacement and people being receptive to people wanting to leave areas of war?
Yeah, thank you so much, Arnold, for the question again. Like I said, when people are moving due to war, they are no longer migrants. They are refugees. If they go to another country, they can apply for asylum. Now they become asylum seekers. So those are not migrants because there's war, there's violence, there's displacement. Like the displacement is forced. So they are no longer migrants. However, what it affects is that when refugees come in, most of the time, not most of the time actually, because all East African Community countries have ratified the United Nations Refugee Convention 1951, they are legally required to accept them and to give them shelter. So if I come from a country like Sudan where there's war and I land in Kenya, automatically the government is mandated to give me protection. They cannot send me back according to the convention. And if they do, they are violating it because I'm fleeing war. Now, this becomes a problem because when we have influx, so many refugees who are coming into the country, and the government is mandated to give them protection and to give them ID cards and for them to settle, then they cause tension with the host communities. So now you have a situation whereby people are now saying, we have so many, like in Kenya, we have a large number and a growing number of the Somali community. So people are saying, all these Somalis are coming, they're taking up our jobs, they're settling in our areas. Now, because they're refugees, they also have access to funding, like the grants that are the money that is given by UNHCR, resettlement funds. They have access to this so they can be able to buy housing and live in areas. And there's also gentrification. So there are all these complaints because refugees have protection. However, migrants don't have protection. So if I was to go today to Sudan when the conflict has ended, and I go there and settle and look for a job, I'm not getting any protection because I'm a migrant. But him coming to my country, him or her, when there's war, gets protections, gets all this. So now this causes tensions with how we deal it. And it's a factor to look at when you talk about just migration. What are we offering and how are we dealing with these two things? Like, are we giving more priority to refugees vis-a-vis migrants? Are we giving them more priorities than host communities? How do we ensure we have a balance? Yeah. Yes, Boniface, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Brian, for this important conversation. I think my observation is that no matter if we have these protocols and these laws, movement is happening anyway. So I would say that is one of the challenges facing these bilateral relations between countries, because even if we have ratified these protocols or not, movement is happening anyway. And that's why I had actually written in the chat box earlier. Do you think, there is that spirit of East Africanness, of undugu and being friendly and everything? Should we reach a point where, as Kenya, we now say we are cracking down on illegal immigrants so that we can make sense of the protocol that we have with other countries? Because if there is an influx of Burundians, Rwandans, Tanzanians in Gikomba everywhere, I don't think we need these laws. People are moving anyway. What do you think?
So two things. Number one, people are moving, but we have to be very careful. Are they moving legally? Because, like, for example, within the East African region, we know that, like in Kenya, for example, Kenya is a little bit open in terms of it has waived worker permit fees. It allows for movement with just your identification card if you come from within the EAC region. So yes, they may easily move. But for example, if you were to go to Burundi, you are required to have a passport. If you are to go to work in Burundi, you are required to be able to pay the worker fees, for example. And this is not just Kenyans to Burundi. Even Ugandans going to Burundi have to fulfill the criteria. If Ugandans go to Tanzania, they have to fulfill the criteria because of how the status of how they've implemented the common market. So movement is happening. However, most of it, of course, some of it is illegal. But again, it is not as smoothless as it should be according to the common market. Because the common market protocol, when you talk about just migration within it, it means that if today I can go study at the University of Bujumbura, they will accept my degree certificate. I can be able to get work there, study, buy land in Burundi, marry there if I want, and resettle there and live there all my life. It should be like that. However, it's not being implemented to the fullest. And when you talk about cracking down on illegal immigrants, we also have to be very careful how we use that because we know that Kenya is a signatory of the United Nations Convention of Refugee. We are also a signatory we've ratified our common market protocol. So some of these people that we call illegal immigrants are technically legal immigrants within our laws. But of course, the host community, because of the imbalance that we were discussing with Arnold earlier on, feel that they've been left out of this illegal, quote unquote, illegal immigrants have more protection. So when you talk about a just migration system, we need to, number one, educate the citizens about Kenya's legal legal protections that Kenya offers, the legal frameworks and legal instruments that Kenya has ratified, but also the definition of who is a migrant, who is not a migrant, who is a refugee. And again, try to find a balance between host communities to ensure that host communities can freely accept these migrants when they come and they can be able to settle, grow with them, so we don't have this tension. Like, as you mentioned, the tension is currently there, of course, because people can see in their neighborhoods so many migrants from Rwanda, from Burundi as well, from Uganda, from refugees from Somalia within the country, and people are wondering, how did they end up? How are they there? Why are police not dealing with them? But me, if I start my business, police. So there's a whole conversation around there, but that resolves within the country rather than talking about the Common Market Protocol. It's not a failure of the Common Market Protocol. It's a failure of the Kenyan governance systems itself. Yes, Renson.
Well,
Okay.
did I read your hand? Okay. But maybe like I just had one particular issue when it comes now to the CMP. I just feel like most of the EAC countries, they should have maybe a common currency, something of the sort. But I just feel like it is something that is not feasible for a number of reasons that okay, I'm not going to mention them so that I can disclose my case, but yeah, something of the sort. So what is the feasibility of these East African community states like having a common currency in order for them like to facilitate its endeavors?
Yeah, thank you so much, Renson. One thing to correct, the common currency does not fall within the common market. Common currency falls within the monetary union. You remember these pillars? There was a pillar of the monetary union. Ideally, East African community, the treaty envisages having one monetary union, having a common currency, having one central bank. Of course, none of this has been implemented as of now, but the common currency is not a factor of the Common Market Protocol. Common Market Protocol deals with, yes, Ransom, go ahead again.
Oh yeah, sorry. It is not even the common currency. It was like this way. Like if I have the Kenyan money and I go to Tanzania, I can use it for transaction there. I can still do the same when I go to Rwanda, when I go to Uganda, etc. Is it feasible?
No, it's not feasible because we would need to have a common currency which isn't there, because naturally because currencies have different values. So you cannot just go with Kenyan currency to Tanzania and buy something in Kenyan currency and come back. And also because the role of any central bank is always to regulate the flow of currency within the country. So there's no way that a central bank will allow to diminish their currency of another currency. Now, when we have a common currency, like for example, the euro, which is used around the 27 Eurozone member states, now we can have that situation whereby we just have one currency. So when I go to Tanzania, I don't have to change my money. If I go to Rwanda, I don't have to change my money. But that is really, really far from being implemented because the systems and the structures haven't been passed. However, one way to look at it also as well is that we need to have harmonization of standards, because harmonization of standards will really help, because it means that if you are an innovator as a young person and you've innovated your product in Kenya, you can go sell it in Tanzania without acquiring standards from Tanzania and Kenya as well. So once I get my standards from Kenya, it's already accepted because we have a mark of conformity within the region. That is far from being implemented because each country has its own form of standardization. But if we can be able to resolve this, then this will really solve like the way you talk. But however, it's not feasible as of now because the structures aren't put in place. But progress is still being made though. Yes. Thank you so much, Renson. So as we conclude, when you talk about just migration system, what do we want? Number one, we want to see the rights and dignity of migrants, but also refugees being upheld within the East African region. I know this is in fact something so much to consider based on what we've seen now with the political tensions. Like, for example, we've seen like Kenyan political activists going to Uganda and they're being arrested. We know there was a time like Burundians cannot go to Rwanda Burundian political figures cannot go to Rwanda, and Rwanda vice versa cannot go to Burundi. So we need to uphold the rights and dignity of migrants. If I want to escape Rwanda and go and settle in Uganda because I feel the political system is oppressive to me, then Uganda accepts me. Uganda doesn't jail me and then take me back to the Rwandan government and says, here's a fellow who was running away. We need to come up with systems that uphold the rights and dignity of migrants and refugees. We also have to ensure that we have free and safe movement within the region, meaning that the 22 one-stop border posts, can we increase them to have as many, because we know that our region has a population of more than 190 million people. So we need not 22, but can we have even 100 one-stop border posts linking across the East African Community member states? We also need to harmonize our migration laws, and I'll emphasize so much on the migration laws because each country has their own definition of even citizenship. By the way, each country also has their definition of citizenship. Like, for example, I think should be Tanzania has single, Kenya has dual, Uganda, I'm not sure whether they have dual, Rwanda as well. So you have a situation whereby if I'm Kenyan and I go and live in Uganda for 20 years and marry a Ugandan, I can acquire Ugandan citizenship and still maintain my Kenyan citizenship. However, if I was to go to a country like Burundi or South Sudan where they don't have dual citizenship, I'll have to forego my Kenyan citizenship for me to acquire South Sudanese citizenship. So we need to look about how do we harmonize our migration laws and policies so that we can have a coherent and coordinated approach to migration governance. We also have to strengthen our labor migration, talking about robust mechanisms for protection of workers, looking at the International Convention on Civil and Economic and Political Rights, ICPPR. How do we ensure that we establish robust mechanisms to track even labor abuses, to ensure that children are not being trafficked from one country to another to go work in mines, to go work in informal sector. So we need to strengthen labor migration when you talk about a just system. And lastly, data collection and knowledge. Unfortunately, even when I was making this presentation and even in the research paper that we did, we were relying on data from the International Organization for Migration. East African countries, we need to have a monitoring system to be able to collect our own data on the number of migrants moving from one country to another, how many of them have moved in legally, what's the flow of goods and services. We need to track this data so that it can inform policy implementation, but also policy formulation as well. And with that, I would open up for question. I hope that we've had a very insightful period learning about migration and governance within the region. Yes, Arnold.
Thank you. Yes, I've learned a lot. Hopefully everybody else has learned a lot as well. So I was listening to that last piece, and the question is basically, without, I guess, giving away too much of a cheat code, because everybody, hopefully, the social justice debates, you should have some sort of solution. So without giving everybody the cheat code, but I heard you say a common currency or money and something about the common labor protocol, because you hit a major thing about child labor. Do you look at those two of the major ways of finding a solution to how does this work? Because this has been going on for 15 years, and I know it's probably not going to be fixed overnight, but where do you see a way of accelerating the success of it?
Thank you, Arnold. Any other question before I answer it? Okay. So what I would say is that as a region, that is really, really a big problem. But the EAC Treaty, because the EAC Treaty underpins the Common Market Protocol, the Common Market Protocol is within the EAC Treaty. The EAC Treaty has very strong provisions around protection of children, protection of human rights. It's a very big, like they have very big articles that talk about it. However, one reason why it's a challenge is because, as you can see, different countries have different forms of government. And because they have different forms of government, it means that implementation of the law becomes different. But I know in every East African Community national member state, they have child protection laws within their labor laws, and which is handled by the Ministry of Social Protection. That is usually not a factor under the Ministry of Justice or the Office of the Attorney General. However, we've always been treating it as an economic issue rather than a human rights issue. And I think that's the problem why it hasn't been tracked, because as long as many of the times children are being forced to work in order to feed their families or get income, or most of the abuse of children within the work environment is because of income, and most of these families come from poor families or informal settlements or in the rural areas. So when the government treats it as an economic problem within the East African region, it means that they look at solutions. They don't like punish it as a crime. So if I am a parent and my child is caught working, or I force my child to go work somewhere and not be in school, they cannot be imprisoned. That's a problem. But if they were to look at it as a human rights issue, then they would have protections whereby and punishments offered to parents or even companies that employ children. However, as of now, that lacuna is there because we've always treated it as an economic issue rather than a human rights issue. And this comes to the whole migration debate that you always, and even you heard from Boniface when Boniface was talking about the conversation on illegal migrants. We always look at it based on economics. We don't look at it based on human rights. We don't look at it based on how many children are being affected. What are some of the rights and benefits like a child is being denied to, like the normal right of being in school, right to education when they work. We always look at it as economics. These migrants, are they getting jobs? Are they be able to get their services? Are they able to settle somewhere and do something? We don't look at it based on the human rights angle. And this is something that I hope the debate will change. But I would also advise that even as we're coming for that debate that will be in Arusha, can we look at how can we nationalize and integrate the international conventions on child protection within the East African region and within the Common Market Protocol, even though the status of human rights adherence within our region, as you may know, and civil rights is not quite high. But of course, some progress can be made because we have the East African Court of Justice, and petitions and legal recourse can be done. But how can we integrate that within the Common Market Protocol? That's one area we should look at it in the debate, definitely, Arnold. Yeah, so I think any other question before we call it a day? Yeah, so at this stage, I'm going to give to Farisa to say the last words before we call it a day.
Thank you so much, Brian. I hope the silence means people internalizing and trying to come up with arguments that and the whole talk was so valuable that people still start track. But if you have any questions, guys, this is the time to ask. I mean, that's the reason why we invited Mr. Brian, and we cannot thank you enough for the sessions you've given. For the session you've given, I think I would also want to participate. I feel like I already have arguments. I was trying to understand how I would argue this topic, but from this I can figure out a way. But hey, nah, I'm not gonna debate for the sake of Gabriella. I won't. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for coming and keeping time as well. Like I mentioned, this is going to be our last theoretical session up until now, the day of the competition. So the whole of next week we are going to be having spars. All right, so this is time for you to now actually have your arguments ready, cross-examination questions ready, and everything of the sort. Next week it's spars. I want us to do as many as possible so you guys can say we were ready. If you have any questions, just you can forward them to me, then I'll forward it to Mr. Brian. He'll be joining us in Arusha as well, so you could come up with questions you want to ask him before the debate, or if he's in your room, you can just ask him prior. As you can see, he's very friendly, very welcoming, so he got you. And as usual, all the resources that I will get, they will be on the folder for SJD. So just hop on there in like an hour or so. Everything should be uploaded. I think that's pretty much it on my end. Thank you once again, Brian. Thank you, everyone. I can't thank you guys enough. See you in about 2 weeks. Unless there's anything else, I think we can safely conclude.
I have one question now that I think about it. If you guys still have time.
Yeah, go ahead.
So part of the debate that I'm going to be taking part in is regarding the EAC and the Common Market Protocol. But there's two sides. There's one side arguing that there should be a full implementation of the CMP and that that's the best way to bring about a just migration system. But the other side is arguing that rather than prioritizing a long-term blueprint of making a just migration system with the CMP, they're saying rather than doing that, they want to start focusing on the protection measures and policies that can be immediately changed or changed quicker than the time it would take for the CMP to fully implement. What are your opinions on that side of the argument? That you should be focusing on the policies and the protection measures rather than fully implementing the CMP to achieve a just migration system.
I think I'll be arguing the debate if I say that.
Oh, what'd you say?
I don't know whether it's in order for me to talk about that since it's the debate topic. Is it, Farisa?
Yes, yes, it's perfect. It's
Yes,
the reason why we're having this. You go ahead. Yes.
Okay. So, yes, like for example, if I am criticizing the Common Market Protocol, I'm against it. When I talk about isolated recruitment protection measures, I'm going to look at what are some of the effects of either loss of sovereignty, abuse of human rights, or limited implementation. What are some of the effects of full implementation of the Common Market Protocol within our country's socioeconomic progress and within the Vision 2030 in Kenya or Vision 2045 if I'm in another country, in Rwanda, for example. So I'm going to compare and contrast. So, for example, you had like the way Boniface talked about illegal migrants taking up jobs, taking up opportunities. So that is an effect of the Common Market Protocol. If you were to have an isolated mechanism for our own country whereby we pick, we don't want illegal migrants from Somalia, but we would want migrants from Japan or migrants from Philippines, because Philippines would come, they would work as nurses, they would improve our healthcare. So that argument could be that let us stop migration let's stop migrants coming in for areas or who have labor or skills that are already in the market. So we don't want migrants who are coming as informal workers. We only want migrants who have a bachelor's degree and they've studied medicine. So that becomes better for the growth of our country rather than just letting anyone just come and work and produce their goods. Like, it's not benefiting us. And most of the time, when these workers are coming up because they can work for lower pay, it means that the average citizen can fail to get a job, because an average citizen will demand like to be paid at a certain rate, and you find a migrant can even work half the price. So now that becomes a situation whereby you can really argue that a country cannot develop economically if they just have open and free movement of goods, persons, and labor within the region, and especially when these countries have a lower GDP than the country where they're coming to. So that can be one of the arguments. The other argument can be when people are moving from when there is free movement of goods, we cannot be able to control issues to do with drugs. We cannot be able to control counterfeit. We cannot be able to control and protect local production. That can be one of the arguments. Another argument in favor of you saying that let us have a isolated recruitment and protection measures is that we can guarantee the sanctity of our education system, because we are not comparing a degree in Kenya vis-a-vis a degree in Uganda, because we believe that a degree in Kenya has higher value because people study many number of years, the content that they're studying is different, the teachers are well trained, so we cannot say a degree in Kenya has equal value. That's an argument. I'm not saying it's the reality, just for example, as an argument, has same value with a degree in Uganda. So we cannot allow just somebody to come work in Kenya if you've studied in Uganda. So again, we are protecting the sanctity of education. There are so many points you can point out on the benefits of having an isolated nationalistic procedure rather than a common market protocol, based on the fact that the common market protocol, in my opinion, hasn't been fully implemented, and there are some things, there are some areas, there are some elements that have failed. For example, like the people who have fled, like their parents were involved in political struggle in these countries whereby the president has ruled for over 40 years, like in Uganda or in Rwanda, where the president doesn't want to leave. Just saying as an argument where the president doesn't want to leave. If I've seen my father being imprisoned, being tortured in the cells in Kigali, and I decide to come to Kenya and settle, again, if we allow that behavior, it means that we propagate the lack of democracy in these countries. We shouldn't be allowing these people to come, because when they come here, then it's like we are being involved in the politics of that country, of which we don't want. We just want to involve in selling of goods and services as a country. We don't want to be involved in this person is running from here. So there are some arguments you can make, a lot of arguments if you're opposing the motion, even more than if you are going to argue in favor of the Common Market Protocol, in my opinion.
Right, guys, it's tough to say that you all cannot say, we have not given you everything. No, it's between you and your gods in the debate room. Are there any other questions that you'd like to be addressed? I called this supposed to be a cheat code, guys. Utilize this time. I don't think there's any tournament you can get this. Just say. Anyways, Brian, I think you can end the recording. But anyone else who has a question, you can go ahead.
Sorry. What was the last statement you made? I think you said something about like when you were explaining how they could approach using the like the policies and protection measures. What was the last sentence you said? Did you say something like you preferred something over something?
Personally, I would prefer to defend the isolated protection measures based on the national laws. You remember there's a slide within the presentation which talks about the national laws of each country. I would prefer to defend that over the Common Market Protocol because, okay, in a debate setting, I'm not saying in a reality setting because I'm pro having open borders, like not open
Right.
borders, but having free movement. But in a debate setting, it's much easier to defend nationalistic measures based on the national laws that I pointed out rather than the common market.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Yes, Bravin.
So my question is, you see, Kenya recently with the UNHCR signed, like launched the Shirika plan to integrate the refugees who are come from Somalia to Kenya, but to find that the communities who are living with them, they were trying to protest that they don't want that. Also, the refugees themselves, that they were protesting that they don't want that because when they will be integrated, they lose their tokens that they receive from the UN. What can you talk about that? Like, yeah.
Yeah, personally speaking, I always, although now that's different from the Common Market Protocol because Somalia hasn't been accepted as a member. But to answer the question, personally, I always feel that there's a flaw within the Refugee Convention in how that there should be an amendment to that. It's been there for over 74 years. Unfortunately, hasn't been reformed because there should be a mechanism whereby immediately the war stops, the country hosting refugees can send them back, can deport them back without any further like legal considerations. So like, for example, you know that Somalia, technically the war ended when now they have like a government, though Al-Shabaab controls most parts of the country. But we should be able as Kenyans to send these Somalis back to their country to rebuild their country. But now because the convention says that it should be willing repatriation, then there's no refugee who's come who will just say, I'm going to leave Nairobi, go back to Kismayo and rebuild my country. So now that becomes a challenge. And then the host communities don't have the power to like send them back if they don't want to integrate. Now that is, for me, I think, a flaw of the Refugee Convention because it makes like a refugee be like a supranational citizen, whereby they have more rights than citizens of even the countries they are going to, which is a little bit crazy. And probably that's the reason why there are some countries where wars never end. You've heard this talk about a country that hosts UNHCR refugee camps, the war will never end. Could be that now there's a lot of preference and we give a lot of super privileges to refugees over citizens, and that's why some of these issues cannot end. So I don't know how that can be solved, though that's outside of the Common Market Protocol. It's food for thought. Yeah. So I think with that, we can call it a day. Yes, we can call it a day. I'm so grateful for everyone who joined the call. I can share the slides should you need them. I can share some additional resources to read. If you have any questions, please, you can pop up on my WhatsApp, on my email. I'm ready to answer it, to assist you to understand more about the Common Market Protocol and national laws on migration stroke refugees within our countries in East Africa area, for those not from East Africa. And I look forward to seeing how the debate will unfold. It will be interesting.
What's it called? Did you put the slides in the chat? The
No,
building.
I'll put them in the SJD folder, which you should have access to in the group, but I will reshare the folder again, like once everything is up. So we'll be on a
Okay.
folder with every other material so far we've had.
All right, thank you.
No problem. Yeah, I think we can call it a day. Thank you so much, Brian. Flowers are waiting for you when you come to Arusha. Everyone is very grateful, I can tell. And yeah, let's see what they can come up with for your enjoyment when you come for the debate and even for their own preparations. Thank you so much. I think we can end it here. But if there's anyone who has like a question, we can stick around for like 2 minutes, but we can end the recording now. Then give it like 2 minutes. At 30, we can all like depart. It's perfectly fine.